Garrett Blackwood was a man who had buried his heart long before Sarah Sterling arrived at his ranch. She was a woman abandoned by the man who should have protected her, carrying a child and a sorrow too heavy for words. In the middle of a Wyoming winter, two wounded souls meet, not as savior and victim, but as equals learning how to trust again. Beneath the snow, something begins to grow, not just romance, but healing, dignity, and the quiet promise of a future built on honest ground.
The wind in Wyoming didn't just blow, it hunted. It was January 1878. The air in Copper Creek felt like shards of broken glass. I stood on the wooden platform, shivering. The train was gone. All that remained was a trail of black smoke being swallowed by the white sky. I looked down at the bundle in my arms. Sammy was 5 months old. He was the only warmth I had left in the world. My husband, Julian, was gone too. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the scrap of paper he'd left in the suitcase. It said, "I can't do this, Sarah. You're better off without me." It was a lie, of course. A man doesn't leave his wife and child in a blizzard because he wants them to be better off. He does it because he is a coward. I looked at my son. His eyes were closed. His breath was a tiny, fading mist. "Listen to me, Sammy," I whispered. My voice was thin. "A human being is not an object. We are not old coats to be left on a bench when the journey gets hard. Every person has a right to be treated with respect." Julian forgot that. He thought our lives were something he could just throw away. But he was wrong. Our value doesn't go away just because he left. I couldn't stay at the station. The station master had already turned the lamps out. He had a warm stove at home. I had a suitcase full of rags. I started walking. The snow was up to my knees. Step, breath, shiver, step. I held Sammy tighter. I used my own body to block the wind. It was a heavy price to pay, but a mother's life is a shield. That is the first law of nature. Then I heard it. The jingle of harness bells, the rhythmic crunch of heavy hooves in the crusty snow. A cutter, a small, sturdy sleigh, slid out of the gray curtain of the storm. The man driving it was wrapped in a coat of heavy wolf fur. He looked like a mountain carved out of shadow. He pulled the horses to a halt. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at me. His eyes were dark. They were the eyes of a man who knew what it felt like to lose everything. "You're a fool to be out here," he said. His voice was deep, like low thunder. "I am a mother," I replied. I kept my head up, even though my knees were shaking. "A mother is never a fool for trying to keep her child alive." He hopped down from the sleigh. He was tall, very tall. He stepped toward me, and I didn't flinch. "I don't take charity," I told him. My teeth were chattering now. "I have 2 hands. I can work. I am a human being with a brain and a soul, and I will earn my keep." The man stopped. He looked at Sammy, then back at me. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with something else, recognition. "Sarah Elizabeth Sterling," he said. It wasn't a question. "I go by Sarah Vane now," I said. "Vane is a name for a ghost," he muttered. He reached out and touched the edge of Sammy's blanket. "My name is Garrett Blackwood, and you're right, Sarah. A person shouldn't have to beg for the right to survive. In a civilized world, we look out for one another. Not because of a debt, but because it's the right way for humans to live." He reached for my suitcase. He threw it into the back of the sleigh as if it weighed nothing at all. Then he held out a hand to help me up. His hand was huge. It was warm. "Where are you taking me?" I asked. "To my ranch," he said. He looked toward the horizon where the mountains sat like jagged teeth. "The storm is only getting started, and you've had enough of the cold." I climbed onto the bench. He wrapped a heavy buffalo robe around me and the baby. It was the first time I felt my toes in an hour. Garrett took the reins. He looked at me one more time. The hardness in his face didn't go away, but it softened at the edges. "Listen to me, Sarah," he said. He spoke clearly. He wanted me to hear every word over the wind. "No one is going to discard you again, not while you're on my land. A woman has a right to sanctuary, A child has a right to a hearth. You don't owe me your soul for a warm bed." He snapped the reins. The horses lunged forward. "You are safe with me now," he said. I leaned back against the seat. I looked at the dark silhouette of Garrett Blackwood against the white world. I didn't know him, but I knew the truth when I heard it. I wasn't a piece of luggage anymore. I was a person again. And for the first time since the train pulled away, I let out a breath that didn't feel like a sob. The Blackwood Ranch house didn't just sit on the land. It stood against it. It was a massive structure of stone and cedar, hunkered down against the Wyoming wind like an old bull. Garrett Blackwood steered the horses up the final rise. The lights in the windows were amber. They looked like warm eyes in the dark. He didn't speak. Garrett wasn't a man for small talk. He just drove. The runners of the sleigh hissed over the snow. "We're here," he said. Short. Simple. I gripped Sammy tighter. My hands were finally starting to sting. That was a good sign. It meant the blood was moving again. If you don't feel the sting, you're in trouble. I knew that much about the cold. Garrett hopped down. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace. He reached up and took Sammy first. He held the baby like he was holding something made of glass. Then he reached for me. His hand was like a warm vice. He didn't just help me down. He lifted me. "Walk," he commanded. "Keep the blood flowing." We stepped onto the wide porch. The door swung open before we could knock. A woman stood there. She was tall. Her hair was the color of a winter sky, pulled back tight. She wore a heavy wool dress and an apron that smelled of cinnamon and lye. "Garrett," she said. Her voice was like a cello, deep, resonant. "I saw the lamps. Who have you brought?" "Sarah," Garrett said, "and her boy. They were at the station. Julian Vane left them." The woman's eyes widened. She looked at me. She looked at my face for a long time. Then she looked at my eyes. A flicker of something passed over her face, recognition. But she didn't say a word about it. "I'm Martha," she said. She stepped back and gestured toward the heat. "Come in, child. Bring the boy to the fire." The house was grand, polished wood, heavy rugs, a fireplace that could hold a whole log. The heat hit me like a physical weight. It made my head swim. I sat down in a chair by the hearth. My bones felt like they were melting. Garrett stood by the door. He was shaking the snow off his coat. He looked at me, then at Martha. "She's a sterling, Martha," he said. His voice was quiet. Martha paused. She was pouring milk into a small pot. "I see it, Garrett." The judge's eyes, plain as day. I looked up. "You knew my father?" Martha walked over. She sat on a stool near me. "Everyone knew the judge, Sarah. He was a man of law. But a man of law isn't always a man of heart. He kept his secrets in Cheyenne, but secrets have a way of traveling on the wind." She reached out and touched my hand. Her skin was rough, but her touch was light. "Listen to me," Martha said. "You look like you're waiting for someone to ask for your papers. You look like you're waiting for a bill. But there is a truth you need to hear, and I want you to hear it clearly. Hospitality is not a business transaction. It is a human duty. When a person is cold, you warm them. When they are hungry, you feed them. You don't do it because they are worthy. You do it because you are human, and they are too." I felt a lump in my throat. I've spent my life being told I was a mistake, a secret, something to be hidden. Garrett walked over. He stood by the mantel. He looked down at the fire. "A person is not a mistake, Sarah. Circumstances are mistakes. Choices are mistakes. But a living, breathing soul, that is a fact. And facts deserve respect." He looked at me. His dark eyes were steady. "You have a right to safety," Garrett said. "That is the first thing I want you to understand. In this territory, people think safety is something you buy with a gun or a pile of gold. They are wrong. Safety is a right. It belongs to the woman in the storm just as much as it belongs to the man in the castle. You are safe here. because it is your right to be safe, not because I am being generous. I looked at Sammy. He was warm. He was breathing deep. I don't know how to just take, I whispered. Then don't think of it as taking, Garrett replied. Think of it as a pause. Everyone needs a place to stand while they figure out their next step. This is your place. Martha stood up. I'll fetch some dry clothes for you, and a bed for the boy. We have a room upstairs. It hasn't been used in a long time, but it's clean. Garrett watched her leave the room. Then he looked back at me. Julian Vane, he said. The name sounded like a curse in his mouth. He took your money? He took everything, I said. He thought he could leave me with nothing. Garrett shook his head. A man can take your coins, Sarah. He can take your house. But he cannot take your value. That is something you carry inside you. It's like the grain in a piece of oak. It's part of the wood. It doesn't go away just because the weather gets rough. He turned to leave the room. He stopped at the doorway. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we talk about the future. But tonight, the only thing you have to do is exist. And that is enough. I sat by the fire for a long time after he left. The house was quiet. The wind howled outside, but the stone walls didn't move. For the first time in a year, I didn't feel like I was falling. I felt like I'd hit the ground, and the ground was solid. Morning in Wyoming comes with a glare that hurts the eyes. The snow reflects the sun until the whole world looks like a sheet of white fire. I woke up in a bed that was too soft. The blankets were heavy. Sammy was still asleep beside me, his little fists tucked under his chin. I didn't stay in bed. I couldn't. A woman like me, a woman who has lived on the edges, doesn't know how to be idle. Idleness feels like a trap. I dressed in the clothes Martha had left me, a simple wool skirt, a sturdy blouse. I went downstairs. The kitchen was full of steam and the smell of bacon. Martha was there. So was a man I hadn't seen before. He was older, thin, with spectacles perched on the end of a sharp nose. He was sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of leather-bound books. Morning, Sarah, Martha said. She pointed to a plate. Eat. You'll need your strength. Who is this? I asked, looking at the man. Elias Thorne, the man said without looking up. His voice was like dry parchment. I manage the Blackwood finances, and right now the finances are a mess. Garrett walked in from the back door. He was wearing heavy boots and a canvas coat. He looked at Elias, then at me. Elias thinks the world is made of ink, Garrett said. He sat down and poured a cup of black coffee. He forgets that the ink follows the cattle, not the other way around. I looked at the books on the table. My father had been a judge, but my mother had been a seamstress who kept the books for every shop on our street. She had taught me numbers before she taught me to sew. May I see? I asked. Elias looked up. He gave me a thin, patronizing smile. These are complicated, Mrs. Vane. It's mostly supply costs, grazing fees, and export tallies. It's dry work. I walked over. I reached out and turned the ledger toward me. I scanned the columns. My eyes moved fast. I saw a tally for winter hay. Then I saw a deduction for miscellaneous transport. Your math is off on page 42, I said quietly. Elias stiffened. I beg your pardon? You carried the 4, but you didn't account for the weight loss margin on the Cheyenne run, I said. I pointed to a line. That's a 12% discrepancy. It makes it look like you lost money on the steers, but you didn't. You just didn't account for the shrinkage. The room went silent. Martha stopped stirring the pot. Garrett paused with his cup halfway to his mouth. Elias blinked. He leaned in. He pulled his spectacles down. He looked at the page. He looked at it for a long minute. She's right, he whispered. He looked at me, his eyes full of a new, confused respect. Where did you learn to read a ledger like that? My mother, I said. She taught me that numbers are the only thing in this world that don't have an opinion. They just tell the truth. I looked at Garrett. He was watching me. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were bright. I told you I could work, I said. I don't want your charity, Mr. Blackwood. I want to earn my keep. Let me handle these books. Let me find the rest of the mistakes. Elias started to protest. Garrett, this is highly unusual. A woman managing the Blackwood accounts. Garrett held up a hand. It was a small movement, but it shut Elias up instantly. A person's mind has no gender, Elias, Garrett said. His voice was steady. If she can see what you missed, then she is the right person for the job. We live in a world that tries to put people in boxes. They say a man does the thinking and a woman does the feeling. That is a lie. It is a lie designed to keep half the world's talent in the dark. He leaned forward, looking at Elias. Respect for a person means respecting their ability, Garrett continued. If Sarah has a gift for numbers, it would be a sin against her dignity to make her scrub floors instead. Every human being has a right to use the talents they were born with. That is how a person keeps their soul intact. Garrett looked at me. The job is yours, Sarah, if you want it. I want it, I said. I pulled out a chair. I sat down. I felt the weight of the leather book under my hands. It felt good. It felt like power. I have a condition, I said. Elias scoffed. A condition? Yes, I said, looking Garrett in the eye. I am a mother. My son comes first. I will work when he sleeps. I will work while he is in the room. But I will not be told that my child is a distraction. A woman shouldn't have to choose between her work and her family. She is a whole person. She can be both. To tell her she must choose is to tell her she is not allowed to be her full self. Garrett nodded slowly. I agree. Sammy is welcome in any room where you are. A child is a part of life, not an interruption to it. I turned to page 1. I picked up a pen. The ink was dark. For the next 4 hours, the only sound in the room was the scratch of my nib and the crackle of the fire. I worked. I found 3 more errors. I found a grazing fee that had been paid twice. I found a shipping manifest that didn't match the rail receipt. By noon, I had saved the Blackwood Ranch nearly $200. Elias sat across from me watching. He looked humbled. He looked like a man who had just realized the world was much bigger than he thought. Garrett came back in around lunchtime. He stood behind me and looked at the clean, corrected columns. You're fast, he said. I'm focused, I corrected. Focus is what happens when a person is allowed to do what they were meant to do, Garrett said. He put a hand on the back of my chair. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat from him. People think dignity comes from a title or a bank account. It doesn't. Dignity comes from the work of your own hands and the clarity of your own mind. You are standing on your own feet today, Sarah, even while you're sitting down. I looked at my ink-stained fingers. I looked at Sammy, who was playing with a wooden spoon on a rug by the fire. I am Sarah Sterling, I said quietly. I think I'm done being Mrs. Vane. Good, Garrett said. Vane was a shadow. Sterling is a name with some weight to it. He looked out the window at the endless Wyoming plains. A person is like a tree, Sarah, he said. You can prune the branches. You can even cut it down to the stump. But if the roots are deep, it will grow back. You've got deep roots, I can see them now. I picked up the pen again. I didn't feel like a woman abandoned at a station anymore. I felt like a woman who was starting to build her own station. And I knew for the first time in my life that the ground beneath me wasn't going to give way. The snow had turned to a fine, biting powder. It hissed against the window panes of the study. I sat at the heavy oak desk. My eyes were tired. The numbers on the pages were starting to dance. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When you have been a ghost for as long as I have, you find that work is the only thing that makes you feel solid. Sammy was in his basket by the fire. He was chewing on a piece of smooth, sanded pine Garrett had given him. He was content. That was my anchor. There was a heavy knock at the front door. Not a neighborly knock, not the rhythmic thud of a friend. It was sharp, official. It was the sound of the world catching up. I stood up. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. Martha appeared in the doorway. She looked at me. Her face was grim. She didn't have to say a word. I knew. There is a man, Martha said. "A U.S. Marshal. He's asking for Sarah Vane." "I am Sarah Sterling," I whispered. But I knew the law didn't care about the names we chose for ourselves. It only cared about the names on the papers. Garrett was already in the entryway when I walked out. He didn't have his coat on. He stood like a pillar of stone between me and the door. The man standing there was short, dressed in a gray suit that looked too thin for Wyoming. He held a leather portfolio. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said, "I am Marshal Miller. I'm looking for a woman traveling under the name Sarah Vane. She's wanted for questioning in a federal fraud case." Garrett didn't move. "There is no Sarah Vane here. There is a Sarah Sterling. She is my head of accounts." The marshal sighed. It was a tired, bureaucratic sound. "Names are slippery things, Mr. Blackwood, but the crimes are real. Thousands of dollars in forged railway bonds. Her signature is on every one of them." I felt the room tilt. I stepped out from behind Garrett. My voice felt like it was coming from a long way off. "I am here," I said. "I am Sarah. But I haven't stolen a cent." Marshal Miller looked at me. He opened his portfolio and pulled out a sheet of paper. He handed it to Garrett. I looked over Garrett's shoulder. There it was, my signature. The elegant S, the sharp L. It was my hand. I remembered signing it. I remembered Julian standing over me in Cheyenne. He had told me it was a power of attorney. He had told me it was to protect our future. "I signed this," I whispered, "but I didn't know what it was." The marshal shook his head. "Ignorance isn't a defense in a court of law, ma'am." Garrett turned to look at me. He wasn't angry. He looked focused. He looked at the paper, then he looked at the marshal. "Listen to me, Miller," Garrett said. His voice was low. It vibrated in the small hallway. "The law is supposed to be a shield for the innocent, not a trap for the exploited. If you use the law to punish a woman for the lies of a predator, you aren't serving justice. You're just finishing what the predator started." The marshal looked uncomfortable. "I have my orders, Blackwood. Every human being has a right to be protected from deception," Garrett continued. He took a step toward the marshal. "A signature is more than just ink on a page. It is a person's word. It is their identity. If a man steals that signature through lies, he hasn't just committed fraud. He has committed a crime against that person's soul. He has stripped her of her agency." I looked at the marshal. I felt a strange heat rising in my chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a cold, hard clarity. "Mr. Miller," I said. My voice was steady now. "You are looking for a criminal, but you are looking at a victim. Julian Vane used my trust as a weapon against me. He treated me like a tool, not a person. And a person has a right to their own name. They have a right to the truth. If the law cannot see the difference between a thief and a woman who was lied to, then the law has no dignity left." Marshal Miller looked at the floor. He looked at the paper in Garrett's hand. "I can't just walk away," he said. "But I can see that she isn't running. You're the biggest rancher in the county, Blackwood. If you vouch for her, I can leave her here while I track Vane to Colorado. But if she leaves, it's on your head." "She isn't going anywhere," Garrett said. "She has work to do, and she has a home here." When the marshal left, the house felt quiet. Too quiet. I went back to the study and sat down. I looked at my hands. They were the hands that had signed those bonds. They felt heavy. Garrett came in and sat in the chair across from me. He didn't speak for a long time. "He used me," I said. "He took the one thing I had, my name, and he made it a curse." "Julian Vane thought you were an object, Sarah," Garrett said. "That is his crime. He failed to see the humanity in you. He thought you were something he could use and then throw away at a station. But a person's dignity doesn't come from a signature. It comes from their character. And your character is something he could never forge." He leaned forward. He looked at the ledgers on the desk. "We are going to find the truth in these books," he said. "We are going to use the numbers to prove who you are. Because the truth is the only thing that can restore a person's rights once they've been stolen. You aren't a ghost, Sarah, and you aren't a criminal. You are a woman who is learning that her life belongs to her, and nobody else." I looked at him. I realized then that Garrett Blackwood wasn't just protecting me. He was teaching me. He was teaching me that I had a right to exist without apology. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Respect isn't a gift, it's an obligation. I'm just doing what's right. Now let's get back to those numbers. We have a thief to catch." The discovery didn't happen all at once. It happened in the quiet hours after midnight. The house was silent. The only sound was the popping of the embers in the grate. Sammy was tucked into his blankets upstairs. I was alone with the Blackwood books. I had been tracing the miscellaneous transport fees for 3 hours. On the surface, they looked fine. A few dollars here, a few dollars there, but numbers have a rhythm, and this rhythm was off. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I started a new column. I compared the rail receipts with the feed bills, and then I saw it. It wasn't a mistake, it was a bridge. Elias Thorne wasn't just skimming money. He was creating a debt. He was overcharging the ranch for supplies that never arrived, then borrowing money from a third-party lender to cover the costs, a lender called the Sterling Holding Company. My breath caught in my throat. Sterling. That was my father's name. But my father was dead. I worked until the sun began to gray the edges of the sky. By the time Martha came down to start the coffee, I had a map of a betrayal. Elias Thorne wasn't just a manager. He was a parasite. He was intentionally driving the Blackwood Ranch into a technical bankruptcy. He was making Garrett look insolvent on paper, so that the holding company could move in and seize the land. And the holding company was owned by Elias himself. I heard boots on the stairs. Garrett walked into the kitchen. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for 4 years. "You're up early," he said. "I never went to bed," I replied. I held up the pages. "Garrett, we need to talk about Elias." We sat at the kitchen table. I spread out the papers. I didn't use jargon. I didn't use fancy terms. I just showed him the truth. "Look here," I said. I pointed to a line. "He says he bought 5 tons of hay in November, but the rail receipt only shows 3. He pocketed the difference. Then he used that loss to justify taking a loan from himself. He's charging you 20% interest on your own money." Garrett stared at the numbers. His face went pale. Then it went very rat-dark. "I trusted him," Garrett whispered. "He was with me when Margaret... He was here when everything fell apart." "Trust is a sacred thing, Garrett," I said. I looked him in the eye. I wanted him to hear me. "But trust without transparency is just an invitation for exploitation. A person has a right to know the truth about their own life and their own business. When a man hides the truth to gain power over another, he isn't just a thief. He is an oppressor. He is denying you your right to make your own decisions." Elias walked in then. He looked fresh. He looked confident. He stopped when he saw the papers on the table. He saw me. He saw the look on Garrett's face. "Garrett," Elias said. His voice was smooth. Too smooth. "I didn't realize we were having a meeting so early. Mrs. Vane, I hope you aren't bothering Mr. Blackwood with those minor discrepancies again." Garrett stood up. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, terrifying weight of an avalanche. "They aren't minor, Elias," Garrett said. "They're a map of your soul, and it's a small, ugly place." Elias tried to laugh. "Now, Garrett, let's be reasonable. Numbers can be interpreted in many ways." "No," I said. I stood up too. "Numbers are the only things that don't lie. People lie. People use words to confuse and manipulate, but 2 plus 2 is always 4. You took Garrett's grief and you used it as a mask. You thought that because he was hurting he wouldn't look. You treated his pain like a business opportunity. I took a step toward him. Integrity in labor is a moral law, Mr. Thorne, I said. A man who works for another has a duty to be honest, and an employer has a right to be treated with fairness. By stealing from this ranch, you haven't just stolen money. You've stolen the hard work of every hand in the bunkhouse. You've stolen the security of this family. You have violated the basic respect that one human being owes to another. Elias's face changed. The mask slipped. His eyes went thin and cold. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he hissed at me. "You're just a woman Julian Vane threw away. You're a nameless nobody in a borrowed dress." "She has a name," Garrett roared. The sound made the plates on the shelves rattle. "And she has more honor in her ink-stained thumb than you have in your whole body. You're finished here, Elias. I want you off my land, now!" "You can't fire me," Elias sneered. "Check the contracts, Garrett. I have a legal right to stay until the audits are complete. And I own the debt. This ranch belongs to me in 60 days. Garrett looked like he was going to break Elias in half, but I put a hand on his arm. "No," I said. "He doesn't. Because the audits are complete. I finished them an hour ago." I looked at Elias. "A person's rights don't end just because someone writes a crooked contract," I said. "A contract based on fraud is no contract at all. I have the proof of your embezzlement. I have the forged receipts. And I have the letter I wrote to the marshal this morning. You didn't just steal from Garrett. You used federal mail to move those loans. That's a felony." Elias went white. He looked at the door. He looked at Garrett. Then he turned and ran. Garrett didn't chase him. He just watched him go. He looked at the empty doorway for a long time. Then he turned back to me. "He almost had it all," Garrett said. "He almost took everything I had left." "He couldn't take it, Garrett," I said. I sat back down at the table. My legs felt a little shaky now. "Because you chose to look. You chose to value the truth. Transparency is the only thing that keeps us free. When we hide our lives from each other, we give power to the shadows. But when we stand in the light, the shadows have to run." Garrett sat down next to me. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at Sammy, who was waking up and making little soft noises in the other room. "You saved me, Sarah," he said. "No," I replied. "We saved each other. I gave you the numbers, but you gave me the place to stand so I could find them. Every person deserves a place to stand. That is the most important right of all." He reached out. He didn't take my hand, but he touched the edge of the paper I had written on. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known," he said. "I'm just a person who finally knows her own worth," I said, "and I'm not letting anyone take it again." The sun was up now. It was a bright, cold morning. The math of betrayal was over. The math of our lives was just beginning. And for the first time, the numbers finally added up to something like peace. The morning was quiet, not the heavy, suffocating quiet of a storm. It was the soft, breathing quiet of a house that had finally found its rhythm. The air in the kitchen smelled of pine sawdust and the last of the breakfast bacon. Elias Thorne was gone. He had left in the middle of the night like a thief in the dark, which, as it turned out, was exactly what he was. His absence felt like a window had been opened in a room that hadn't seen fresh air in years. I was at the table. My pens were laid out. The ledgers were open. But for once, I wasn't looking at the numbers. I was watching Garrett. He was standing by the window. He was holding Sammy. It was a sight I never thought I'd see. The tallest, hardest man in Wyoming territory cradling a 5-month-old boy. Garrett's hands were scarred. They were calloused from ropes and cold steel. But when he shifted Sammy's weight, he was as gentle as a summer breeze. Sammy wasn't crying. He was reaching up. His small, chubby hand grabbed onto Garrett's thumb. He gripped it tight. Garrett didn't move. He didn't pull away. He just stood there looking down at my son. "He's got a strong grip," Garrett said. His voice was a low rumble. "He's a fighter, Sarah." "He had to be," I said quietly. "He learned that from the start." Garrett turned around. He looked at me. then back at the baby. "Children are the only truly innocent things we have left," Garrett said. He spoke clearly. He wanted me to hear him. "A man can lose his way. He can let greed or grief turn his heart into a stone. But a child? A child is a clean slate. They remind us that every human life begins with hope. And it is the primary duty of every adult to protect that hope, no matter whose name the child carries." I stood up and walked over to them. I put my hand on Sammy's back. "I spent a long time thinking Sammy was a burden to the world," I whispered, "because that's what Julian made me feel. He made me feel like Sammy was an anchor dragging us down." Garrett shook his head. He looked me right in the eye. "That is the greatest lie a man can tell," Garrett said. "A child is never an anchor. A child is a compass. They show us which way is north. They remind us why we work, why we build, and why we fight for the truth. Every child has a basic human right to be a priority, Sarah, not a distraction, not an afterthought. To treat a child like a burden is to fail at being a man." Sammy made a soft gurgling sound. He let go of Garrett's thumb and patted his chest. Garrett actually let out a small, huffing laugh. It was a beautiful sound. "I lost my own boy," Garrett said. The words came out slow, like they were heavy. 4 years ago, he never even drew a breath. And for a long time I thought that meant I was finished with being a father. I thought my heart had closed its doors. He looked at Sammy again. "But grief is a selfish thing," Garrett continued. "It makes you think your pain is the only thing that matters. It makes you forget that the world is still turning, and there are people who need you. I've realized something, Sarah. Healing doesn't happen because time passes. It happens because you choose to care about something other than your own scars. Helping this boy stay warm. Helping you find your feet. That's the only medicine that ever worked." I felt a tear prick at my eye. I didn't brush it away. "You're a good man, Garrett Blackwood," I said. "I'm an honest man," he corrected. "And honesty means admitting that we need each other. People like to talk about rugged individualism out here on the frontier. They act like a man is a mountain who stands alone. But that's a fairy tale. Humans were meant to live in a circle, not a line. We are meant to lean on one another. To deny that is to deny our own nature." He handed Sammy back to me. The warmth from his hands lingered on the baby's blankets. "Martha is in the cellar," Garrett said. "She's got some things to show you. Things that belonged to the Sterling family. I think it's time you looked at the past without flinching." I nodded. I held Sammy close. "Garrett," I called out as he headed for the door. He stopped and looked back. "Thank you for holding him," I said. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "A man who doesn't know how to hold a child doesn't know how to hold on to anything worth having." He walked out into the bright white morning. I stood there for a moment, feeling the house hum around me. It wasn't just a building anymore, it was a sanctuary. And for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged within its walls. The lawyer arrived 3 days later. His name was George Barton. He was a man of silver hair and sharp iron-gray suits. He came all the way from Cheyenne. He carried a heavy leather satchel that looked like it had seen every courthouse in the territory. We sat in the parlor. Garrett sat in his armchair. Martha stood by the sideboard. I sat on the sofa with Sammy asleep in a small cradle at my feet. Mr. Barton didn't waste time. He laid out a thick document on the low table. It was yellowed at the edges. It smelled of old dust and sealing wax. "Mrs. Sterling," Barton began. "Vane," I corrected out of habit. "No," Barton said firmly. "You are Sarah Elizabeth Sterling. Your father, Judge Arthur Sterling, made sure of that in his final hours. A man can spend his whole life running from the truth, but when the end comes, the truth is all he has left to leave behind." He pointed to the seal on the document. "Your father knew he had failed you," Barton continued. "He knew that keeping you a secret was a crime against your dignity. He couldn't fix the past, but he could secure your future. This is a secret will. It was held in escrow until I could find you and verify that you were in a place of safety. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What did he leave me? I asked. My voice was a whisper. 250 acres, Barton said. Directly to the east of the Blackwood Ranch. It includes the valley floor and the primary spring that feeds the creek. Garrett sat up straight. I saw his jaw tighten. That's the water source, Garrett said. It is, Barton agreed. Judge Sterling knew the value of land, but more than that, he knew the value of leverage. He left you the most important piece of earth in this county. He wanted to make sure that no one, not a husband, not a banker, not a stranger, could ever tell you that you didn't have a place to stand. Barton reached into his satchel and pulled out a smaller envelope. He also left this letter, Barton said. He asked that I read it to you. Barton cleared his throat. He looked at the page. To my daughter, Sarah, he read. I have lived a life of public honor and private shame. I have judged many men for their sins while hiding my own. I did not give you my name when you were a child because I was a coward. I feared the whispers of the town more than I valued the heart of my own flesh and blood. I closed my eyes. I could hear my father's voice in the formal, stiff words. I realize now that a child's worth is not a matter of public record. It is an inherent fact. You were a Sterling from the moment you were born, and my silence did not change that. It only diminished me. I leave you this land because land is the only thing that does not lie. It does not judge. It only gives back what you are willing to put into it. Be better than I was, Sarah. Be brave enough to be seen. Barton finished reading. He folded the paper and handed it to me. The room was silent. I looked at the map of the land. 250 acres. It was a kingdom. He kept me in the dark for 30 years, I said. My voice was thick. He thought land could buy back the time he stole. He thought a deed could replace a father's hand on a shoulder. I looked at Garrett. But he was right about one thing, I continued. He was right that I have a right to be seen. Every human being has a right to be recognized for who they truly are. To hide a person is to try and erase them, and no one has the power to erase another human soul. Garrett stood up. He walked over and looked at the map. He looked at the boundary line where his land met mine. That water is the lifeblood of this valley, Garrett said. Sarah, do you understand what this means? You aren't a guest here anymore. You are a neighbor. You are a landowner in your own right. I looked at my ink-stained fingers. I understand, I said. I understand that my father finally did his duty, even if he was 30 years late. Parental accountability is a debt that never expires. You don't get to walk away from the life you created just because it's inconvenient. He finally paid that debt. Martha walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. You've got the sterling eyes, child, she said, but you've got your own spirit. Use that land. Grow something real on it. Don't let it be a monument to his shame. Let it be the foundation of your pride. I looked at Sammy in his cradle. This is for him, I said. I want him to grow up knowing that he belongs to the earth beneath his feet. I want him to know that he is not a secret. He is a Sterling, and he is a Blackwood neighbor. I looked at Garrett. What happens now? I asked. Garrett looked at me. For the first time, he smiled, a real wide smile that reached his dark eyes. What happens now, Sarah, is that we stop surviving, and we start building, Garrett said. We are going to protect that water. We are going to raise that boy. And we are going to show this territory what happens when two people stand together on honest ground. You have your rights now, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever tries to take them again. Mr. Barton packed his satchel. He looked satisfied. I've delivered many wills in my time, he said. Most of them just move money from one pocket to another. But this one moved a person from the shadows into the light. And that's the only kind of law work worth doing. When he left, the parlor felt different. The air felt lighter. I held the deed in my hand. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt as heavy as a mountain. I was Sarah Sterling, I was a landowner. I was a mother. And for the first time in 31 years, I knew exactly who I was looking at when I saw my reflection in the window. I was a woman who had been found, and I was never going to be lost again. The peace was a fragile thing. It was like the thin ice that forms over a creek in the early morning. It looks solid. It reflects the sky. But beneath it, the water is still moving, cold and hungry. I was in the study, tracing the boundaries of the Sterling land on the map. 250 acres. It was a lot of dirt. But dirt carries a weight that can crush a person if they aren't careful. I was learning that ownership isn't just about what you have, it's about what you're willing to defend. The front door opened. I didn't hear a knock. That was the first sign. In Wyoming, you don't walk into a house without announcing yourself unless you think you own the place. I walked into the hallway. My heart was a drum in my ears. He was standing there. Julian Vane. He looked exactly the same expensive wool coat, the same silver-tipped cane, the same smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, the smile that used to make me feel like I was the only woman in the world. "Sarah," he said. His voice was smooth. It sounded like honey poured over gravel. "You look well. The country air suits you." I didn't move, I didn't breathe, I just looked at him. "Get out," I said. Julian chuckled. He stepped further into the house. He looked around at the high ceilings and the fine furniture as if he were appraising a shop. "Is that any way to greet your husband?" he asked. "You aren't my husband," I said. My voice was low. "A husband is a protector. You are a predator. You left me and your son in a blizzard to die. You didn't just walk away from a marriage, Julian. You walked away from your humanity." He sighed. He looked down at his boots. He looked like a man who was deeply misunderstood. "I had business to attend to," he said. "I knew you were strong. I knew you'd find a way. And I was right, wasn't I? You found a rancher, a millionaire, no less." He looked toward the study door. He saw the map on the desk. "And I hear you've come into some land," Julian continued. "The Sterling property. That's a very valuable piece of earth, Sarah. It has the water rights for the whole valley. I think we should talk about how to manage it. Together." I felt a cold rage rising in me. It was a clean, sharp feeling. "Listen to me, Julian," I said. I stood tall. I didn't hide. "There is a lesson I learned the hard way, and I want you to hear it clearly. Predatory behavior is not a character flaw. It is a choice. You believe that because you are clever, you have a right to exploit the people who trust you. You think my love was a weakness you could use as a currency. But trust is a sacred right between two people. When you break it, you don't just lose the person. You lose the right to ever speak their name again." Julian's smile faded. His face went flat. He looked less like a gentleman and more like a snake. "I'm still your legal husband, Sarah," he hissed. "In the eyes of the law, what's yours is mine. I've been talking to Elias Thorne. He's a smart man. He knows how the world works. We've already started the paperwork to contest that will." "The only thing you're contesting is your own shadow," a voice boomed from the stairs. Garrett was there. He hadn't made a sound coming down. He was holding a shotgun. He didn't have it pointed at Julian, but the weight of it was there. It was a period at the end of a sentence. "Blackwood," Julian said, trying to regain his posture. "This is a private matter between a man and his wife." Garrett stepped onto the floor. He walked past me. He stood so close to Julian that Julian had to look up. "A man who abandons his family has no private matters left," Garrett said. "He has forfeited his place in the circle of society." "You talk about the law, Vane, but the law of the frontier is simple. You protect what is yours, and you respect what belongs to others. You failed at both. You don't have a legal claim to this land because fraud is a rot that kills any contract, and Sarah's signature on those bonds, we have proof of your coercion." Julian looked at the gun. He looked at Garrett. "You think you can just take her?" Julian sneered. "You think she's yours now?" "No," Garrett said. "She belongs to herself. That is the point you can't understand. A woman is not a prize to be won or a piece of property to be traded. She is an autonomous human being with the right to choose her own path. She chose to be here. She chose to work. And she has chosen to be done with you. Julian turned back to me. He tried one last time. He softened his voice. "Sarah," he whispered, "think of Sammy. He needs his father." "Sammy needs a man to look up to," I said. "And you are just a hole in the shape of a person. A father is a man who stays when things are hard. A father is a man who values his child's safety more than his own comfort. You don't even know what color his eyes are, Julian. You didn't just leave me. You betrayed the most basic obligation a human has, the duty to care for the life they brought into this world. That is a debt you can never repay." I pointed to the door. "Leave," I said, "before the marshal gets here. I sent word to him an hour ago. He's very interested in that paperwork you and Elias have been doing." Julian's eyes went wide. He looked at the door. He looked back at us. The silver-tongued grifter was gone. He looked small. He looked like the coward he had always been. He didn't say another word. He turned and ran. He stumbled down the porch steps and disappeared into the gray light of the afternoon. The house felt silent. I leaned against the wall. My knees were shaking. Garrett set the gun down on the table. He didn't come to me. He stood where he was, giving me space. "You did it, Sarah," he said. "I told him the truth," I whispered. "The truth is the only weapon that works against a man like that," Garrett said. "He depends on lies. He depends on people being too afraid or too polite to call him what he is. But once you name the wolf, he loses his power to bite. You claimed your own life today. That is the hardest thing any person ever has to do." I looked at him. "He's working with Elias," I said. "I know," Garrett replied, but Elias is a rat, and rats run when the lights come on. We're standing in the light now, Sarah, and we're staying there." I walked over to the window and watched the snow fall. Julian was gone. The shadow was gone. "A person's past can be a prison," I said quietly. "But only if you let the jailer keep the keys." I think I just threw the keys away. Garrett nodded. "And you didn't just do it for yourself, you did it for the boy. You're showing him that a Sterling doesn't break, and a Blackwood doesn't forget." For the first time since I stepped off that train, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I felt solid. I felt real. And I knew that the wolf wouldn't be coming back to this gate. The wind had died down by evening. It was one of those rare, still nights in Wyoming where you can hear a pine needle hit the snow a mile away. The sky was full of stars, sharp, cold points of light that looked like they could cut through the dark. We were in the study. Doc Emmett Shaw had arrived an hour ago. He wasn't there for a medical call. He was there as a friend. He was sitting in the leather chair by the fire, nursing a glass of cider. "I've been carrying this for a long time, Garrett," Doc Shaw said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cream-colored envelope. The wax seal was broken, but the edges were crisp. Garrett stared at it. He didn't move. I saw his hands tighten on the arms of his chair. "What is it?" Garrett asked. His voice was hoarse. "It's a letter from Margaret," Doc Shaw said. "She gave it to me 2 days before the end. She told me to keep it until the day I saw you start to live again. She said I'd know when that was. And looking at you now, looking at the way you've brought Sarah and the boy into this house, I think the time has come." Garrett didn't reach for it. He looked like he was staring at a ghost. "Grief is a heavy cloak, Garrett," I said gently. I stood up and walked over to him. "But sometimes we wear it because we're afraid of what we'll feel if we take it off. We think that if we stop hurting, we're forgetting. But that's a lie we tell ourselves to stay safe in the dark." Garrett looked at me. His eyes were full of a pain that went back 4 long years. "I wasn't there," he whispered. "I was in Cheyenne. I was buying cattle while she was dying." "Listen to me," I said. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Forgiveness is not a luxury. It is a necessity for survival. You are holding yourself accountable for a tragedy you didn't cause. You believe that your absence was a crime, but nature doesn't check the calendar. You have a right to be at peace with the man you were, so you can become the man you are meant to be. Doc Shaw held the letter out again. This time, Garrett took it. His fingers were trembling. He didn't read it to himself. He stood by the fire, and he read it aloud. His voice was unsteady, but the words were clear. "My dearest Garrett," he read. "If you are reading this, it means I have gone where the wind doesn't blow so hard. I know you, my love. I know you are sitting in that big house, blaming yourself for every mile between here and Cheyenne. Stop it." Garrett choked back a sob. He kept reading. "You were a good husband. You were a kind man. My death is not your failure. It is just the way our story ended. I do not want a monument made of your sorrow. I do not want you to spend your life staring at a grave. What I want, what I truly want, is for you to find someone else who needs that big, stubborn heart of yours. Someone who has been hurt like you've been hurt. Someone who needs a place to be safe." The room was so quiet you could hear the logs shifting in the fireplace. "Love is not a finite resource, Garrett," the letter continued. "Finding a new joy does not diminish the old one. It honors it. It shows that the love we had was strong enough to teach you how to love again. Be brave, my darling. Let the past stay in the past. Your future is waiting for you." Garrett finished the letter. He let his hand drop to his side. He stood there for a long time, looking at the flames. Doc Shaw stood up. He walked over and patted Garrett on the back. "She was a wise woman, Garrett," Doc said. "And she knew you better than you knew yourself. Self-forgiveness is the hardest form of justice there is. We are always our own harshest judges. But today the court is adjourned. You've been paroled, son. It's time to walk out of the cell." Doc Shaw picked up his bag and nodded to me. "Good night, Sarah," he said. "Good night, Garrett." After the doc left, Garrett turned to me. He looked different. The lines around his eyes seemed softer. The weight in his shoulders had shifted. "She knew," Garrett said. "She loved you," I replied. "And when you truly love someone, you want them to be free, even from you. That is the highest form of respect there is, wanting a person's happiness more than you want their memory." Garrett walked over to me. He stood close. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm. It was the hand of a man who was ready to build something. "I've been a dead man walking for 4 years, Sarah," Garrett said. "I thought that by staying miserable I was being loyal, but I was just being stagnant. Every human being has a right to heal. We have a right to move forward without carrying the bones of our yesterday into our tomorrow." I looked up at him. "I know what it's like to be defined by a tragedy," I said. "Julian made me a victim. My father made me a secret. But you made me a partner. You saw the woman beneath the rags, and in doing that, you reminded me that my value wasn't something that could be taken away. It was something I just had to reclaim." Garrett reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from my face. "We are 2 people who were left at the station," he said. "Different stations, maybe. But we were both waiting for a train that wasn't coming. And then we realized we didn't need the train. We had the ground beneath our feet, and we had each other." I leaned my head against his chest. I could hear his heart. It was steady. It was strong. "Safe," I whispered. "Safe," he agreed. "And free. That is the only way for 2 people to truly stand together. Not because they are trapped, but because they have chosen to stay." We stood there by the fire for a long time. The past was finally where it belonged. Behind us. The snow was still falling outside, but inside the air was warm. The debt of grief had been paid in full, and for the first time the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like a promise. "Let's look at that map again tomorrow," Garrett said. "We've got a lot of work to do on that land of yours." "Our land," I corrected. "Our land," he said. And as the clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, I knew that the story of Sarah Sterling wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a beginning, and it was exactly where I was meant to be. The winter didn't go out with a roar. It slipped away in the night, dripping off the eaves and sinking into the dark, thirsty soil. By March, the air in Copper Creek had changed. It didn't bite anymore. It tasted of damp earth and the promise of something green. I was standing in the garden plot behind the big house. It was a square of mud right now. But in my mind, I could already see the rows of carrots and the bright faces of the sunflowers. Sammy was sitting on a thick wool blanket a few feet away. He was busy trying to eat a blade of dead grass. "Not that, Sammy," I said. I picked him up and wiped his chin. "Wait for the fresh stuff. It's coming." I looked out toward the east. My land, the Sterling land, lay under a thin veil of morning mist. It was beautiful. It was mine. But as I stood there, I realized that land is just dirt until you decide what it's for. Garrett walked up from the barn. He was carrying a roll of barbed wire and a post hole digger. He looked leaner than he had in the winter. Harder, maybe. But when he saw me, the tension in his shoulders just evaporated. He set the tools down and walked over. He took Sammy from my arms and hoisted him onto his shoulder. "The frost is deep this year," Garrett said. He looked at the mud. "But the drainage is good. You've got the best soil in the valley, Sarah." "I was thinking about the fence," I said. "The line between my land and yours." Garrett looked toward the horizon. He didn't say anything for a long minute. "Fences are funny things," Garrett said. He looked at me, his eyes steady. "Most people think a fence is for keeping people out. They think it's about drawing a line to say this is mine and that is yours. But a fence is actually a statement of respect. It's a way of saying that I recognize your space and you recognize mine. Without boundaries, there can be no true partnership because you can only give what you truly own." I nodded. I understood what he was saying. He wasn't talking about the wire. "I want us to build it together," I said. "Not to keep us apart, but to show where we meet. Every human being has a right to their own identity, Garrett. I spent my life being an extension of someone else. I was the judge's secret. I was Julian's victim. But here, on this ground, I am my own person. And I think that is the only reason we can stand here like this. Because I don't need you to save me anymore. I choose to be with you." Garrett shifted Sammy's weight. "That is the only kind of love worth having," Garrett said. He spoke the words slowly, with weight. "Love isn't a rescue mission. It's not about one person being the hero and the other being the prize. A real partnership is when two whole people decide that the path is better if they walk it together. To depend on someone out of weakness is a burden. To depend on someone out of trust is a strength. We have a right to be equals, Sarah, in the books, on the land, and in this house." We walked back toward the house. Martha was on the porch, shaking out a rug. She looked at us and smiled. It wasn't the guarded smile she had back in January. It was the smile of a woman who had seen the spring come back to a dead valley. We sat on the porch steps. The sun was finally high enough to feel warm on our faces. "I have to go into town tomorrow," I said. "Mr. Barton has the final papers. The name change is official. Sarah Elizabeth Sterling." "Names carry power," Martha said. She sat down in the rocker behind us. "But remember this, Sarah. A name is just a label on a bottle. It's the spirit inside that counts. You've reclaimed your name, but more importantly, you've reclaimed your agency. A person's greatest right is the right to self-determination, to decide who they are and what they stand for. Don't let the town's opinion of the Sterling name define you. You define the name." "I know," I said. "I'm not the judge's daughter anymore. I'm Sammy's mother. And I'm the woman who saved the Blackwood ledgers." Garrett reached out and took my hand. His skin was rough, but his touch was light. "We've talked a lot about rights this winter," Garrett said. He looked at Sammy, who was now crawling toward a sunspot on the porch. The right to safety, the right to the truth, the right to be seen. But there's one more right we haven't talked about, the right to a legacy. A legacy isn't just the land we leave behind, or the money in the bank. It's the values we plant in the next generation. It's the way we teach a child to walk upright in a crooked world. He looked at me. I want Sammy to grow up seeing a man and a woman who respect each other, Garrett continued. I want him to see that strength isn't about how much you can take, but how much you can protect. I want him to know that a home is built on honesty, not just stone. That is the legacy I want to leave, and I can't do that alone. I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. Is that a proposal, Garrett Blackwood? I asked. Garrett didn't get down on one knee. He didn't use fancy words, he just squeezed my hand. It's a commitment, he said. A marriage isn't a contract of ownership. It's a covenant of companionship. I am asking you to build a life with me. Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because I am a better man when I am in your company. And I believe we can do more good for this valley together than we ever could apart. Every person has a right to be loved for who they are, not what they can provide. I love you, Sarah, just as you are. I looked at the mud in the garden. I looked at the mist on the hills. I looked at the man beside me. Yes, I said, but I'm keeping my own books, Garrett, and I'm keeping my land in my name. Garrett laughed. It was a rich, full sound that echoed off the stone walls. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. A man who wants a silent partner doesn't really want a partner at all. He just wants an audience. And I've had enough of being the only person in the room. Martha stood up and smoothed her apron. Well, she said, I suppose I'd better start planning a dinner. A real one, with the good china. She walked back into the house, humming a tune I didn't recognize. I leaned my head against Garrett's shoulder. You know, I said quietly, when I was standing at that station in the snow, I thought the world was ending. I thought Julian had taken everything. But I realize now that he only took the things that didn't matter. He took the lies. He took the fake security. He left me with the only thing that was real, my son, and my own will to survive. Adversity is a cruel teacher, Garrett said, but it's an efficient one. It strips away the fluff. It shows you what you're made of. You found your worth in the dark, Sarah. That means no one can ever take it away from you in the light. Because you know now that your value doesn't come from a husband or a father. It comes from within. That is the ultimate freedom. We sat there for a long time watching Sammy play. He had found a small, smooth pebble and was inspecting it with great seriousness. Look at him, I said. He's not afraid. He shouldn't be, Garrett said. Fear is a reaction to the unknown. But Sammy is known. He is loved. He is protected. That is the foundation every child deserves. To grow up in a world where the adults are honest and the fences are clear. That is how we build a civilization, one porch at a time. The sun was high now. The mud was starting to dry. The creek was rushing, full of snowmelt, singing a song of movement and change. I wasn't the woman from the station anymore. I was Sarah Elizabeth Sterling. I was a mother, I was a partner, I was a neighbor, and as I looked at the man beside me, I knew that the winter was truly over. We had been through the storm. We had found the truth in the numbers, in the grace, in the grief. We stood up together. Garrett picked up the post hole digger. I picked up Sammy. Let's go see about that fence, I said. Let's go see about our future, Garrett replied. We walked off the porch and onto the damp, honest earth. The ground felt solid beneath my feet. It didn't shift. It didn't give way. I was safe. But more than that, I was home. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what that meant. It wasn't a place on a map. It was a state of being. It was the knowledge that you are seen, you are respected, and you are standing exactly where you belong. We walked into the spring and we didn't look back. This channel shares powerful stories about Western cowboys, love on the frontier, motherly devotion, compassion, human kindness, mercy, healing, and the strength found in ordinary hearts. If this story gave you hope, please give it a like, leave a meaningful comment, share it with others, and subscribe so we can continue bringing you stories that touch the soul.
As Sarah Sterling's journey comes to an end, we are left with more than a Western tale of snow, land, betrayal, and love. We are left with a reminder that a human soul can be wounded, but it does not have to remain broken. Sarah began her story abandoned in a Wyoming blizzard, holding her baby against her heart with nothing but fear, cold, and a scrap of paper from the man who had betrayed her. But what Julian Vane failed to understand was that leaving someone behind does not erase their worth. Taking away a woman's money, name, safety, or home does not take away her dignity. Sarah's strength was not born because Garrett Blackwood rescued her. It was already there, buried beneath pain, waiting for a place safe enough to rise again. This story teaches us that kindness can become a turning point in another person's life. Garrett did not offer Sarah pity. He offered her respect. He gave her shelter without demanding her soul, work without denying her motherhood, and protection without trying to own her. Through him, we see that true strength is not measured by how loudly a man speaks, how much land he owns, or how many battles he has survived. True strength is the ability to protect without controlling, to love without possessing, and to stand beside someone until they remember how to stand on their own. Sarah's story also reminds us that a mother's love is one of the most powerful forces in this world. Sammy was not a burden. He was her reason to keep walking through the storm. In every hardship, Sarah chose life because her child needed her. That is the quiet heroism of motherhood, the kind that does not ask for applause, but holds the world together in cold rooms, hungry nights, and impossible mornings. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: our past may shape us, but it does not have the right to define us forever. Sarah was once a secret daughter, an abandoned wife, and a falsely accused woman. But by the end, she became a mother, a landowner, a partner, and a woman who knew her own name. Garrett, too, learned that grief is not loyalty, and healing is not betrayal. Together, they showed us that love is not a rescue mission. Real love is a partnership between two people who choose honesty, respect, and hope. So when you leave this story, remember this: no betrayal can destroy your value. No storm can last forever. And no cruel person has the final word over your life. Sometimes the road to home begins in the coldest place you have ever stood. Sometimes the family you deserve is found after the family that failed you walks away. And sometimes, on honest ground, with courage in your heart and truth in your hands, you can build a future stronger than anything you lost.